the answer to problems like plastic is to get to a point where we can move away from making virgin plastics. All of the plastic we have ever created still exists. Some of it is not usable anymore. You know, if it is sitting in a landfill, if it's in the ocean, if it degrades to a certain point, it can't be used again. And even in a really efficient plastic recycling ecosystem, plastic is not infinitely recyclable. And the hardest thing, much harder than any of the research or design I did, was the personal, moral, mental hurdle of accepting that as we stand as a global society, there is no true sustainable option.
I have a lot to talk to you about. So much. I have so many notes. It's crazy.
Why?
It's crazy when you I don't know, we've been friends for 3 years, but then finally when we sit and try to have a conversation, kind of inorganically, there's so many things that I want to talk to you about. You're a very interesting person, sir. And I want to talk to you. All right.
Thanks very much.
Let me start. I'm going to introduce you.
Okay. Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to not allowed, but how conversational is this or how one-sided is this?
It's only conversational.
So I can then ask you things and you will respond, and it's
absolutely
not
it's okay. No rules here, like the Wild West here. All right.
Perfect.
Okay.
Love it.
So yeah, you've done so much. All right. So Sarah Garrison, you're an industrial designer, graphic designer, photographer, sustainability person, expert,
nerd.
Nerd. There you go. Welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
After our conversation the other day, I checked out Precious Plastic. I want to hear everything about it, but I just wanted to say that it's fucking interesting stuff. I didn't, you know, when you were doing that internship, it was an internship, right? Or a residency?
Yeah, like a residency.
Yeah, so when you were doing this, I did check them out, but I didn't go into detail. But they have this whole system kind of a thing that they've built called the Precious Plastic Universe. That is so cool. So cool. What exactly did you do there? I know they do a lot of stuff, but take me through that exactly though.
So I was in the Netherlands in Eindhoven working for Precious Plastic summer of 2019. Time flies. And they were in the middle of their fourth version, V4. So Precious Plastic is the type of project that it exists continuously, but it's not always being fully staffed and maintained. A lot of times it exists as an online community. And everything is, I feel like I should give a little more information. Basically, it's about plastic recycling, and it makes plastic recycling accessible by publishing free open source plans for all of the machinery needed to process, shred, and then turn that shredded plastic into a new good. But the point is that this is for everyone, and that everyone should be able to do this with just a little bit of money and limited machinery. So it exists as this global online community all the time. People are always exchanging ideas. Some people make the machinery and sell it to other people who want to start their own workshop. Some people, publish. I took those plans and I made it so you can actually pull it on the back of a bicycle. So here's plans for that. And now anyone can take that and then jump from there into a new project. So while I was there, they had received a really large grant. They had won, or I'm not sure if it's a grant, but they had won some sort of big design award. And so they did V4 for 1 year. And so for a full year in the Netherlands, they staffed people who have backgrounds in business, chemistry, machinists, designers, graphic designers, industrial designers, engineers, just a whole slew of people from all over the world who just were passionate about this idea and thought, I have a skill set that could help. So V4 was focused on actually developing the universe that you were just describing. So before that existed, it was a little bit less comprehensive. One of the big pushes this time around was actually to develop open source business plans. So a lot of people have an interest in this, but they don't necessarily have the education or the resources to confidently go out and take out a small business loan or figure out their budget and say, establish a business and have the confidence that financially and based on your location and everything, that it will actually successfully work. So one of the efforts with V4 was to push for more than just, here are plans for a lot of machinery, do what you will with them, but a much larger, more holistic set of instructions and support. So that's the project overall. One of the things with the product designers, I was a product designer there, and I worked with a team of other product designers. We had a few main goals that they wanted to achieve. So most of them fall under the umbrella of the man who started it, Dave Hackens, wanted people to have a larger or different understanding of what you could do with these plastic recycling machines, because most of them aren't being used industrially. So it's not like when you buy a water bottle and it has a certain percent of post-consumer recycled plastic. It's more like people were making little tchotchkes and trinkets and tokens, which is interesting and does allow for that point of education where someone can come in and see it all made and then walk away with their own little piece. But that isn't necessarily feeding into the right mentality about recycling this plastic and reducing our plastic problem. So one of the main challenges for the designers was, how can we inspire people and do the ground level research for more useful plastic objects? So a couple of people were working on making very fine detail things. So like light switches and plugs and gears that go within something, and being able to injection mold on a much finer scale, which is an important thing to show that while not everybody wants to achieve fine detail, this is something that you could pursue, which opens up a whole new world of possibilities for this small scale plastic recycling. And then we had a guy who has a background in architecture, and he actually spearheaded making a brick that is injection molded as well, and figuring out how to make the mold very simple to machine and assemble and very quick to injection mold. So you could very quickly turn out a whole building's worth of bricks and put it together either in a disaster situation or long term. And then the different ways that it could be anchored together. So there's this very large variety of goals that they had for the product designers. I was working with someone on geodesic domes for the most part. So we did a lot of stress testing and modeling and things like that, and material studies, and ended up with the central hubs for geodesic domes, and then wood beams to connect all the hubs. And then we also worked on, more so my partner than I, worked on an attachment for the outside so you could actually cover the whole dome and have it be used more as housing or a greenhouse or a chicken coop. But the reason why they went ahead and specifically did a geodesic dome is since the onset of this project many years ago, that has been the number one requested object. Geodesic domes are structurally very sound. People find them very interesting. They're a really nice way for people to get into design and architecture and spatial design. And they're also very difficult to make on your own and very expensive to buy a kit for. So we were trying to solve all of those needs and have it be, you could just make a couple of molds and injection mold for a couple of hours and then be able to have your own geodesic dome of pretty much any scale.
Well, so the plastic part are the connectors that were,
yeah.
Cool.
We did also test the entire dome being plastic, which is, we do a lot of beam extruding. And those are great for furniture. But they really are not a one-to-one replacement for wood. Based on their strength, their flexibility, their weight, they are significantly heavier than wood. And so it kind of came down to, when we did make a small version that was entirely made out of plastic, but we decided for the economic motivations as well as structural strength that it would make more sense to use wood, and some people have even gone on to play with metal.
So these beams
and then
and
just
like
the plastic connector.
Right. So the beams and the bricks, are they like solid or are they hollow?
So the beams are solid and they can be extruded at almost any length and dimension. Obviously, the plastic will start to cool as extruded, and so there is a length limitation. But the bricks themselves are hollow, so they have a solid shell, but they don't have a top or bottom. And so they actually interlock really well, which is nice because part of the point of these things is whenever possible, you shouldn't be using like an adhesive or a second type of plastic or anything that becomes bonded with the plastic and can't be removed easily, because then that prevents a second iteration of recycling. So, and that kind of goes even into like outside of the precious plastic world, things that are easy to recycle usually are single material and very easy to remove any other material. So with the brick, it interlocks in a very interesting way. And then he also designed a way to run like steel beams through and really anchor it down and make it a more permanent housing if you needed. But again, it can also be erected quickly, used as an emergency shelter, and then deconstructed and either ground, reshred and used for something else, or packed up and taken somewhere else where there's an emergency situation.
Oh, that's very exciting, because like when I was looking up precious plastic, it seems like they're doing everything right in a way like it's supposed to be in my head. They're thinking from a systems perspective. They're using single materials that are easy to recycle, like steel. Steel is highly recycled. It's used like over and over again in your cars and your bikes. It's a very good material. Yeah, and in terms of like plastic what's interesting about it as a building material is that it is really good at trapping in heat. So its thermal capacity is so good. So it's very good for insulation. And it has a lot of good properties in terms of like electricity and all of those things. So yeah, I think there was a project in, I forget where, I think I might be wrong, Ecuador, maybe. What they did was they built this structure out of steel beams, and then they filled in the gaps with plastic bottles for insulation. Yeah. And it was like really kind of effective in a way. But also this professor in India, he also shredded plastic bottles and stuff like that and mixed it with certain percentage of tar to make roads. So what happens is the floods in Mumbai are so heavy and the rain's like so hard on the streets, it really corrodes very easily and like builds potholes that are huge. So these plastics kind of help keep the water off for the most part, and gives the tar some kind of like a structural integrity to not like tear away. Yeah, plastic's like an amazing material to like really, if you can really use it properly.
Yeah.
For my thesis book, you might know this. I interviewed Mark Miodovnik, who is the author of Stuff Matters, and who also has a fun Netflix show about materials and stuff. So he said something very interesting about plastic. So the UK is making a move away from, like, whenever you see some plastic object, there's a recycling logo with a number on it that says what kind of a plastic it is. To, like, the average person, even for me, I don't know what the hell that means, right?
Yeah.
What's number 5? I don't know. So he says that the UK is kind of moving away from that towards a system which kind of tells you how much of this plastic is recycled plastic or reused plastic. So in that way, it kind of like informs the user how effective the system is as a whole. So he says the only chance of making plastic recycling effective is to make the system as a whole effective, much like the steel industry. It's a very effective recycling industry. So yeah, that I thought that was like pretty interesting, because this is something else I want to get into, but we'll finish the geodesic dome topic. But like, even when I'm like trying to recycle, the more I read, the more confused I get. Like,
Yeah.
what goes in the recycling trash? What goes in the normal trash? Should I wash it? Should I take off the labels? Like, what should I do? This is something we'll get into, but a geodesic dome is a very interesting concept, and it was, I think, propagated by Buckminster Fuller. I'm not sure if it existed before him. He just made
My
it
understanding is he developed it.
Right. So it's like his brainchild.
My understanding.
And he kind of loved it. He wrote a poem about it. Do you know that?
Yeah, and he used it whenever possible. Somebody can fact check me. I believe he was the first or one of the first to use it.
I think so.
But
I think so, yeah.
But
wait, I have the poem here. Let me see. Let architects dream of glass boxes with steam and rich clients in hordes at their knees. Salty. Just give me a home in a great circle dome where birds and bees are at ease. It's kind of nice, but it kind of like speaks to the geodesic dome being like it's the strongest structure, the lightest structure, and the most energy efficient structure all in one known to man.
Well, and domes and circles are the most surface area efficient for the amount of space that you can fit inside. So you need the least amount of material to make the exterior surface to achieve that same amount of interior space out of any other shape.
Yeah.
So they're very efficient in that way as well.
The beam structure are in triangles, which is the strongest structure known to man. So
yeah.
Like, the question then is like, why aren't more structures domes?
Are you asking me to speculate?
I'm just like having speculate. I don't know. Maybe, yeah.
So I think we live in a 90-degree world. Occasionally you hear of people who live in 8-sided houses, and I think the thing everyone thinks of is, how is my furniture fit? Buckminster Fuller, I don't know if I believe he was the original designer, but he definitely was. It was under his set of designs. He proposed and prototyped these houses that were circular. They were not geodesic domes, but they were circular, and they were erected around a central mast. They actually have one fully restored in original condition inside the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. And I'll have to look and let you know the name, but that he built everything in the house around the fact that the house was round. And he had streamlined it. He had built in so the airflow worked well, so the water system worked well, so it utilized rain runoff. It was, especially for the time, exceptionally efficient, but it never gained the traction that it needed. And it never became more than a proposed, there were some prototypes, and it never quite made it off the ground. it's a similar form to the dome. I think the geodesic dome is, it's not necessarily a friendly shape to the rest of the world and
Right.
all of the things that we own. The other thing, as someone who spent a lot of time working with and looking at domes, is to achieve a reasonable height for even just like a gardening shed that is a dome, it actually needs a lot of ground footprint to get enough height. Because the way the dome works, it technically, you can't just stretch it upwards like you could with a normal building. And so some people do add basically stilts at the bottom to be able to make the footprint work and still
Right.
achieve the height. But it itself as a shape, to have one large enough to have functions and things, the footprint is massive. And I think that is another problem, and why they sort of get reduced to chicken coops and playground toys. Even though I do think there is more potential for them, there are certain things that still, I think, have yet to be truly solved and overcome. But
yeah, I think I agree with you in terms of like the space equation. I think the fact that it's hard to build is secondary to it needs more space to reach the height, because the extrusion of a circle is different to like a cube.
Yeah.
I wonder how, like, I've never seen the inside of an igloo, but I wonder how that's furnished. Or is it, it is furnished, right? Have you seen the inside of an igloo?
I think we might be picturing a caricaturization of an
Maybe.
igloo. We might be bordering on ignorance here, that people don't actually live in igloos. But I do know that people what? No, I do know that people do live in round and strange shaped homes, but
yeah,
I don't know if they custom build their furniture, if they just let it be. But
yeah, maybe. What kind of, I wonder if, like, are there any animal structures or like structures built by insects that are domes? Ant hills are not domes, they're hills. Beehives are not domes. They're like oval.
Well, a lot of shelves are nautilus shaped. So even though the exterior is sort of round, the interior is a different type of shape.
I think that's an interesting question, isn't it? If it's like efficient, then we should be seeing more of that in sort of like in the biological world, maybe.
We do see a lot of spheres, which this is basically, I think, a more achievable way to build. A true sphere would be very hard to build.
Totally, yeah.
In the same way. And it would not be something that you could hand somebody a kit and say, here's 150 parts, screw them together and you'll have this. I think a sphere is something nature can achieve that we struggle to achieve simply.
Yeah, another like depressing thing is recycling, right? When like when I was like working on that chapter, it was I saw this documentary on YouTube, and it just showed like all of these. I think it was based in the UK, when all of these recycling waste was collected, and they were just sitting at the dock for like years because nobody knew what to do with them, and there was just like mountains of bottles and plastic shit. Like, how do we, I don't know, how do we go about that? Maybe Mark Medovnik is right. There is no like efficient system to kind of tackle that as of yet. So is there I like what Precious Plastic is doing. It's like taking away from that.
They're very aware that it is not a universal answer, and that it does have its own flaws. And they actually, during version 4, did have a couple of people dedicated to working on biomaterials and bioplastics, because anyone who works in sustainability objectively, who or is, you know, an environmentalist even recreationally, I believe would agree that the answer to problems like plastic is to get to a point where we can move away from making virgin plastics. All of the plastic we have ever created still exists. Some of it is not usable anymore. You know, if it is sitting in a landfill, if it's in the ocean, if it degrades to a certain point, it can't be used again. And even in a really efficient plastic recycling ecosystem, plastic is not infinitely recyclable. And there is a lot of science and research behind how many times can you recycle it, at what point do you need to inject what amount of virgin plastic to maintain a certain level of integrity in the material. All of that is for someone much smarter than me to discuss, but most people, when it comes to not what is the profitable solution, what is the solution we can easily integrate into our current lives, but what is the ultimate solution that prioritizes the environment, it's moving away from this material. It's dealing with the amount of waste we have, but not producing more of it until that system to deal with all we already have is completely resolved, which unfortunately in the last couple of years, especially during my thesis at RISD, I spent a lot of time looking at the science behind all of this, looking at how is environmental impact calculated, how are all of these things traced around the world. And this was, I think, the hardest thing, much harder than any of the research or design I did, was the personal, moral, mental hurdle of accepting that as we stand as a global society, there is no true sustainable option. There just isn't. We don't live in a world where you as an individual or you as a corporation that exists to make a profit can be sustainable. And this is not to say we should not try, because there are a lot of people who look at the statistics and say, well, individual consumers only produce, you know, less than 5 or 10% of the pollution and the damage to the environment, so I shouldn't do anything. Of course, that's not the case. Everybody should do everything that they can, but we also need to be putting pressure on our governments, our institutions, our corporations to move away from the current system. But as it stands, there is no global economy solution that is truly sustainable. And that is a very, very hard pill to swallow when you're trying to design even the smallest solution to the smallest part of the great big problem. You still have to face over and over again, no matter what I do, it will never actually be 100% sustainable. It will never be foolproof. It will never not be hurting the environment, which is heartbreaking, but I think a very important thing for us to start having conversations around, not to encourage people to give up, but to encourage people to understand that when you're being sold something that is sustainable, it's probably not. So what does that look like? And how do we continue to raise the standard? And how do we reshape these global systems over realistically 10, 20, 50 years to move to a place where true sustainability is at least within closer reach? But as it stands now, it's just not. And I hate to say that, but that's usually how I have to start most of my serious in-depth environmental conversations, is telling people what expectations to realistically have.
Yeah, I think I think I agree with that. I think the move would be to, like, I don't know, 100% sustainability is obviously not possible. I think a more realistic approach is like looking at circular economies, which are still better. Yeah, and I think as like artists or designers, I think what's important is to really understand the end of a product life cycle and kind of work towards that. I think that's more important than figuring out manufacturing or, I mean, okay, it's not more important, but I think it's equally
very
important, and it's often overlooked, is
yeah.
how would that product die? And
right. Well, and we live in a world, especially in the global north, we live in a world where we're never asked to face the ramifications of any of our decisions as consumers. Even if you know and you're being told and you live in a place that continues to discuss climate change and the human impact on the planet, we all still live with systems that make our trash disappear once a week, that encourage moving towards sustainability through consumerism, which is a false truth. That's not really how it works. That is one of the, I think that is a really important role, both for us as designers, as a communication challenge, but also a lot of artists have made large scale and small scale sculptures, social movements, performance art that attempts to put in front of the everyday person how much waste they create, what the impact of the materials they choose are, the ramifications of buying your groceries that come from all over the world and are prepackaged. There are a lot of efforts, and I think that it is a multifaceted solution is needed, being people who put the truth in front of you, but also we need to be designing with that in mind. We need to be designing that in a way that communicates what you're consuming and therefore what you will eventually be disposing, but also how you can improve that. And by not improving that, what is happening? If there was an environmental nutrition label on everything we consumed, the way we consume would be very different. But as of now, no one is ever forced to stop and look at it. How, one out of every few hundred people probably has ever had to even step foot in a landfill in the global north. People aren't aware. And even when you hear statistics about how many pounds of trash the average American makes every day, that's an abstract figure. But there have been a couple of people there was one man in particular who saved every piece of trash he generated, I think for weeks, and just continued to strap it to his body until he could no longer fit through a door, and was out in public showing people, me as one person, in a couple of weeks, I've made literally a mountain of trash. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Stuff. And I think awareness is directly linked to involvement. And
absolutely.
I think if you're even for me, I wonder how long it would take for me to find it weird. Now when I put my trash in the bin, and then I take it downstairs and it's gone, and I don't have to worry about it till my trash fills up again. And imagine if I have to go out into my backyard. I don't have one, but if I did, I would go out into my backyard and I had to dig a hole in the ground and bury my trash every day. How long would it take for me to feel like this is not the right solution? That is exactly what a landfill is. And we've been doing that for decades.
I think even when people start to compost, which is a great thing, and if you're properly composting, the waste that you're making through compost it's not having a negative environmental impact. But even through composting, you're forced to look at how much food waste you make. And therefore, that has an economic ramification. And of course, any food waste you're making, you've now wasted whatever resources and land and manpower were needed to harvest or produce that food item. And so I do think that's a very common realization for people who start to compost, because you have to save your food waste and then do something with it. And obviously that's so much smaller than the amount of landfill waste we make, but even still, it can be a complete shift in your mindset by having to do that and look and say, yet again, I filled up a 5 or 10 gallon bucket in a week of food waste. How can I reduce this? How can I save money and resources by not buying things I'm throwing out, or thinking differently about the way I'm cooking? So I'm not, can I leave the potato skins on? Can I learn to use the tops of my carrots or whatever? And it doesn't have to be a total, complete lifestyle change. It doesn't have to be, becoming a hippie and eating only what your land can grow.
Yeah.
But by doing that sort of exercise, it does really, I think, promote this awareness. And I think inherently there is some behavior shift when you go through that process. So if we had to do something similar with landfill, I think it's inevitable that most people would have some sort of realization, would have some sort of lifestyle or behavior change.
Yeah. Again,
but
I feel like I say this like
now, it just disappears.
Yeah, I say this every episode. Like, it's not the individual; it's always the system. Like you said, people think that it's like the top 3 or 4 organizations that are like responsible for all of this, but it's really not. Like, the more we talk about, the more we realize that how important chefs are to educate people. Like, Gordon, I watch like Gordon Ramsay recipes all day long, especially during night.
Yeah.
But whenever he talks about like leaving the skin on or something like that, that directly translates to how much waste you create. And even if it's like really small, it multiplies as more people do it. So like everybody involved is so important. Yeah.
Are you depressed yet?
Yeah, I was depressed like 5 minutes into this.
I know. It is very hard. Like I said, I usually have to preface these things. I do some sustainability consulting for small businesses. And one of the first conversations we always have is setting realistic expectations. And I think as individual people and as designers, or in whatever role you're in, I think having some sort of code is helpful, because again, you cannot be truly sustainable in every single facet, but you can say, I really, really care about water usage. And so I'm going to prioritize that one thing. It is inevitable that by doing anything sustainable, there are unintended consequences. By, switching your water system so you're wasting less water, you might inadvertently be using more electricity. Or, there, in every switch we make, there is a really good chance there's an unintended consequence. But I think we should all work to find things we're passionate about, because every single little change helps. And having that guiding factor, it's like any moral or personal code, saying, some people take up veganism or they go meatless or whatever because that's the thing that is within their control, that they're passionate about. And that definitely has an environmental impact. And other people just say, I'm going plastic free, or I'm just going to reduce my plastic or do a good job of recycling it. It doesn't really matter, because again, there's no perfect solution. But I always try to talk to people about finding the thing that matters to you, because when it is personal and you care, you're going to try to do a good job and stick with it. And nobody up and becomes waste free, deeply sustainable, environmental overnight. And nobody ever does it completely.
Yeah.
There's always something, there's always some environmental impact. But I think the biggest takeaway after the depression talk of there's no solution is to find the things you care about, and that can be your sustainable impact. And that's really important. If every single person found one aspect of global warming, environmentalism, sustainability, wildlife preservation, environmental justice, whatever, and spearheaded that one thing in their own personal life, the global change would be like unimaginable. So
yeah, absolutely. Because I think these Sometimes even these little, pieces of, by 2050, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. They can be so detrimental
Yeah.
because it really puts people off. Like, I can't deal with that because I can't help that situation.
Right. Because that is overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's like so much fish and now there are like so many plastic bottles. But
Yeah.
I think I read that Coca-Cola is moving away from plastic bottles and they've come up with a line of like paper packaging for their drinks, which is like kind of revolutionary in like from what we've been doing with like fizzy drinks till up until now.
Sure.
But again, like you said, of course there has to be some environmental ramification if you're producing paper bottles on that scale that Coke does.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And something that's really important to think critically about, as you mentioned, the end of life, the entire life. We don't often take enough time and to be fair, it is not easy to access this information. It requires a lot of research. So this is not something I actually expect the everyday person to spearhead, but it is important to do the best we can to think about the raw materials, the manufacturing, the transportation, the use and consumption, and the end of life. All of those steps individually have a massive environmental impact. So, of course, there's only so much we can do. There's only so much the average person who isn't, getting a degree in this or turning a career into this sort of thing can do. But it is important to be aware that a product has a very long lifespan that involves a lot of steps, and to try to think critically about all of them. I think in the last 10, 20 years, we have done a good job of becoming more aware of what happens when we're done with things. We're starting to talk about microplastics. We're starting to talk about ocean pollution, landfills, the fact that a lot of our trash is being shipped to other parts of the world, which is all terrible. But I do think it's important to, as whenever possible, have conversations about all of the pieces that, especially the ones we don't talk about all that often. Like, this thing might be made of organic cotton, but if the cotton was grown in America, it was shipped to somewhere in Asia to be processed, used a ton of chemicals to do the processing. It was then shipped to a third country or continent to be packaged or produced, to turn it from cotton to string to cloth to clothing, shipped across the world, put in a plastic bag, tags put on it, shipped to a store. The store has to be powered. You have to consume it. It's a never-ending list. Yeah. Well, in water, chemical runoff, a big part of this as well. Like, you cannot have environmental justice without social justice. And so much of this also has to do with who is making all of this stuff that we're consuming. We never have to look at where stuff goes when we're done with it. And we pretty much never have to deal with where did it come from and how did it come to be. But a lot of times it's using really, really terrible labor practices and really unsafe environments. And that's another thing we never have to think about, but it is important whenever possible to take a minute to think critically. And the more you do that, and the more knowledge you acquire, the easier it is to become a better, more conscious consumer. It requires research and effort, but if you do a little bit at a time, anytime something crosses your path and you start to think critically, you take a moment to look something up or investigate further, the next time something like that comes across your path, you're already a better consumer. So I think that is the most reasonable way to try to approach this, because again, it's overwhelming and it's all around us. But if we can pick something we're passionate about and we can take a few minutes at a time to try to learn a little bit more, eventually we will become very discerning consumers who have a much better understanding of what am I consuming, what am I disposing, and where did it all come from and where does it all go?
Yeah. And like that'll lead us to kind of like become aware of these situations before things get worse, like we saw in the case of like Foxconn, who Apple manufacturers, right? And people were like committing
Yeah.
suicides and all of that. It's like it got really bad. Yeah. But you know, yeah, like you said, like in the last episode with Charlotte spoke about how materials are very important, because that kind of has the answer to like climate change in a way, the materials you choose in manufacturing and all of those things. But yeah, Charlotte made a good point. She said that like designers oftentimes they don't mean to, not intentionally, but like they become so kind of elitist with the materials that they produce. It's too expensive to commercialize. It's always like kept in museums or like in shows, but you know, it's not going to be effective till it can reach that price where it can be used in manufacturing, and that's when the impact will come. Yeah. Anyway, talking about materials, like I know you worked at the Nature Lab at RISD and did some exciting stuff. You want to talk about what you did at the Nature Lab?
This is slightly less depressing. So
yeah, let's move on.
I think that's good subject switch. Sorry, everybody. So I worked, while I was at RISD, I worked as a graduate research assistant, and I focused on biomaterials and materials. So Charlotte worked there as well, doing similar work. So the Nature Lab has an existing library of biomaterials, and this was started because students would come in and they would say to the woman who was in charge of all these things, they would say, you know, I have a project, I want to do this thing. And she would sit down and she would dedicate a lot of time to helping them find the right material, figuring out how to make the first batch, and then they would go off and they would make a project, and she would never see the results of the project, but more importantly, this would just happen over and over and over again, semester after semester. And she realized that there needs to be an existing resource that people can come and consult and see samples and talk to people who have perfected the recipes and see what other students have done with the recipes. So I was working on contributing to the library and testing recipes and teaching students and consulting when they had sort of a unique question or idea. And so I did a lot of work with kombucha. So the drink kombucha is fermented by something called a SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria.
It's a monster from Mars in a jar.
It's horrifying. If you drink kombucha and you've never seen a SCOBY, look it up. It'll change your feelings. No, I mean, I came to love them. But yeah, they're very off-putting. They kind of just look like a slab of fat or something that sits in the kombucha and does the fermentation, but it is alive. And so every time you make a batch of kombucha, it continues to grow more SCOBY. It accumulates. And so normally, especially at like a large scale brewery, they just discard of it. And it can be composted. But someone else, not me, discovered that you can actually lay them out and dry them over the course of a few weeks, and then it will shrink down significantly, and you end up with a leather-like material. Now, it's not a perfect leather duplicate, but it is pretty darn close, and you can achieve a really similar color and texture and everything. It's really interesting, and there is a lot of potential, and there are people working on this material all over the world. One of the nice things is this is something that people can grow at home. So when students come in and they want a leather-like product for making a shoe, for making a bag, for using as part of their interior architecture, it's the type of thing where with like $3 worth of ingredients, I can set you up with your own little growing system. And it takes time. It's a living thing. It has to grow. So that was sort of, it inadvertently became my specialty, which was fine. But I also did some other biomaterials, and I also started the natural dye library there. So a lot of these biomaterials, students would try to color, but if you're using a natural material and then you're adding, and usually that means it's something that is compostable, it's something that is less harmful both to create and to dispose of, and then you're using some sort of artificial colorant, you can inadvertently defeat the purpose. So I was working with students on some natural dye attempts, and then I realized in addition to having a material library, we should have a dye library, because it does involve a lot of trial and error, and dyeing, of course, is an ancient art, and I am certainly no expert, but because it's such an ancient art and there are hundreds and thousands of ways to do natural dyeing, to different materials that can be dyed, different ways to go through the dye process, different things that can be used to do the dyeing. We needed at least some sort of foundation to put in students' hands and talk with them about. So that was towards the end of my time at the RISD Nature Lab. That was the project that I was working on, just developing a reasonably sized library of different materials and different dyes. And then from there, it's now a living library, just like the biomaterials library, where I'm no longer contributing, but it continues to live at RISD, and current and future students and employees will be able to contribute and add more samples and add more experiments. And then it just becomes a larger and larger knowledge base for anyone who wants to explore these things from Brown or RISD or even sort of the larger community, can at least have some sort of foundation of knowledge before they then try to do their own project with it.
As I understand, that's like a physical library, but is there a digitized version of that?
Not publicly yet. We have all the assets, but that's the type of thing that nobody has had the time to make, but eventually, yes.
Yeah. Now, dyes are very interesting. Dyes have a lot of political history in India as well, with indigo and all of those things. And indigo can be poisonous to manufacture, and it's a contested story. But in terms of the dyes you worked on, were they like vegetable based, or like would you dye something with beet or something?
Yeah, our biggest attempt was, a lot of dyes actually do require harmful mordants, which is basically a pre-dye. It preps the material to then be able to accept the dye. Without it, it'll just rinse clean. And some of those are, very, very effective, but they require a metal that is toxic. And so it can be done safely, but we tried to stay away from that because that's not something that we can ensure that every single student is understanding how to do it responsibly, unless we have a space where we can monitor them. And at the time, we don't. So we, in addition to focusing on plant-based dyes, we also focus on all the other materials being plant-based as well, the mordants and things like that, or natural. So not necessarily plant-based. Some of them, are natural chemicals, vinegar, things like that. And we also work on things like adjusting the pH. So you can add things that change dye color. You can add different types of metals. You can add baking soda, vinegar, pretty simple things that adjust the pH, which can have a very strong effect on the intensity of the color, the tone of the color. And so that was a lot of what we were doing, was more focused on that, and then also focused on, whenever possible at the Nature Lab, they try to keep things relatively local. So same thing with biomaterials. If you have a student who comes in and says, this is actually one that was done, has been done quite a few times. People say, I want to focus on egg waste. We say, okay, part of this is a consultation where you talk with someone and you say, if you want to use egg waste, there should be a reason behind that. Either this is then going to be used somehow in the industry that uses eggs, that makes sense. Or is egg waste a thing that every bakery in town is not composting their eggshells, they're going to the landfill? Okay, I could collect them and actually do something good with it. Or if you want to use a natural dye, is it something that we can access locally? Is it something that you can talk to your local florist? You can talk to your local farmer. You can go out on a hike and find that mushroom or that moss or whatever it is out in the wild. Because again, with all of these things, whenever possible, you want to reduce all of the different impacts, one of which is localization is better for obviously reduces transportation, but also, the concept of like, oh, it's not littering if I throw an apple core out the window because it will decompose. Well, technically, if we are disposing of biodegradable or compostable material in an area that is not that type of food or ingredient would not have normally been, it can actually have adverse effects. So whenever possible, especially if something is supposed to be, it's a biomaterial that is supposed to decompose, then you really should be thinking about, well, where will it be used and how can I use native materials to that area? So that was a big part of the conversations we have, because the idea of so many of these things are so shiny and exciting, but there's a few layers of thought that once the shiny, exciting part wears off, you start to really think about some of these ramifications or some of these things that get overlooked in the excitement. So part of our job was not to dull the excitement, but to say, here are all the other things that in your enthusiasm, go ahead and consider.
I like that. Yeah, it's like, again, like realistic sustainability, like even when it comes to materials. Do you know that as part of the COVID recovery plan in Europe, they have made this new body called the New European Bauhaus. This was announced
did not.
Yeah, like last week or this week or something. And the New European Bauhaus is supposed to bring Europe into the circle, as like it's ushering Europe into a circular economy. And as part of the council, they have 18 like reputable experts. And 2 of them, you might know, they're from the abstract.
Ellen MacArthur?
No, it's from the abstract show on Netflix. It's Bjarke, the architect, with the steam smoke ring structure, and Oliver Eliasson, who works with that yellow light that makes everything black and white. So I guess that's exciting. I mean, I really exciting. Like them both. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. But okay, so you're from Florida, right? Did you grow up there? Like till
I did.
And you did your like undergrad from there as well.
Right. So I went to the University of Central Florida and got a BFA in graphic design.
Is that also like Go Gators or no?
No,
that's University of Florida.
Yeah, that's Irina and Alex. Both went there.
Mm-hmm. What's your mascot?
Both previous. We have 2. The sports one is the Knights, and the academic one is a Pegasus.
Whoa.
I don't know.
At RISD, our mascot's a penis.
It is, yeah. So I told my mom that, and she was horrified. But the only real claim to fame for UCF is that it, last I'd heard, is the 2nd largest university in the U.S. population-wise.
Wow, that's awesome.
I don't know if that's a good thing, but
I'm sure
it is what it is.
It only means that a lot of students are getting educated, so that's a good thing. There you go. So why did you move from like graphic design to ID?
I actually had always wanted to be an industrial designer. Well, not always, but since I was in high school. But it is not a thing that exists in Florida. No one has heard of it. There are no jobs, no schools. It just isn't a thing. Everybody thought I was talking about engineering or designing factories or
it's a common one.
Interpersonal system. Anyways,
I get packaging a lot. Did you get packaging or no?
Yeah, and I do think that can fall under
It
the
can.
industrial design umbrella. So it's slightly less upsetting than do I engineer factories? No, I don't.
I can,
No,
but I don't.
I could,
I could, yeah.
I guess, with the correct amount of research. Um, but yeah, so I thought about, taking the leap and just going for it, but in-state tuition with all the different grants and stuff is really cheap. And I had really no art and design experience. And so I thought, there's a chance I'm going to be really bad at this or I will not like it. And so I just went around and tried to find the school that kind of came the closest. And UCF has a really big, really strong engineering program. They do a lot of their graduates end up at places like NASA. So I thought, well, I probably won't take any engineering classes, but I can hang out in their maker spaces and get to know some of them. And while I was there, I worked as a graphic designer for the business department. They had a big entrepreneurial program. And so I got to, again, sort of not really industrial design, but I got to work with people who had startups on their packaging and their communication of their product, some product design, and a lot of pitch decks and things like that as well. And I apprenticed with a woodworker just to try to get some hands-on experience. And I went into the program saying, okay, but I really want to do industrial design, not graphic design. And the professors were just kind enough to say, like, all right, I guess that's fine. So they gave me a little leniency when it came to, we'd have a packaging design project and everybody would, come up with the label to put on the can or the box. And I would say, well, can I rebuild the box too? And like, I guess if you want. So I did my best to sort of try to find the middle ground, and it was enough. And honestly, I'm very happy to have a second design discipline. It's very handy.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely. A lot of industrial design is also like presenting the facts in a good, I don't know, in a presentable graphical way, I guess. But in my work also I use a lot of graphic design because I've moved from, one could say UX is a part of ID in a way, like everything could be a part of ID, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of my work also involves UI, and so definitely a background in graphic design helps, which I don't have.
You have good graphic design skills, though.
Oh, thank you.
So I will say, I was going to say that's like the age-old question of what is UI UX, what is digital product design, like who owns it? But I think it's not an age-old question because it's very new. And also, no matter what you say, you will piss someone off. So like, regardless of where you fall on who should own what, until it has its own university programs, which a few have popped up, but until it's allowed to be its entirely separate, independent discipline, somebody will be angry about your opinion of who owns it and how do you get trained to do it, because it is both. So
is it ID? Is it human HCF?
Is it just graphic design? Is it? Yeah, there's no right answer. Regardless, they are all helpful skills, and there's a lot you're going to have to learn on the job anyways.
Mm-hmm. I think the fact that all of those people can do it, maybe it's like a group thing, Maybe there doesn't have to be like one discipline that trains you in UX. Yeah. Because if you look at it, UX is just understanding. Okay, I don't want to define it in like my way, but for me,
bring it on.
Yeah, there you go. Bring on the heat. UX is just understanding, like, to a certain extent, what is needed and how that experience. Obviously, this is like I'm just like digging myself into a deeper hole, but
I'm
whatever.
Not judging. The listeners are judging.
The listeners are judging. Anyway, it's basically like you're mapping an experience and you're building a system that is true to that map and that is true to how effective that is. And and the hardest part, I think, is to map that experience and to prioritize what is the most important, like the hierarchy of importance. So is it important to like buy that product on the website? So then how do you make that website in order to um, make sales happy,
I was going to say, like, get people to do what you want, but yes, to make other teams happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that it is like with so many fields, it takes a lot of learning how to get the truth out of the user when they're testing and using, and then use that information. But so much of it is about actually getting to the truth of their experience, not just what they want you to think is, or what they think they're experiencing. I think it does take a lot of understanding of like the human psychology of it all, as well as then being able to respond with design. But
absolutely. And that is where like UX researchers come in, where people really prefer somebody with a psych background. And that was just a web development example, but like I did an ID project in India where under like that RISD Commons grant, where I was researching and kind of looking into the problems faced by a wheelchair user specifically to like board public buses. And a lot of the problem was systemic. There was like issues with them having to access the bus stand, and then the buses when they were crowded during peak office time. It's like it's like a nightmare, but it's not just one issue, right? And so that whole thing is an UX exercise, that's an experience exercise
absolutely.
for the wheelchair user. So yeah, that was a tough project.
Yeah.
That was a tough problem to solve. Dude, it was so sad. I remember there was this one bus stand in New Delhi where it was right in front of a car parking lot, right? So the cars were parked on top of the wheelchair ramp that would have been used. And all the bus stops are like a foot higher than the main street. And a lot of the buses don't stop at the bus stop. They stop like on the road. So there's like a dash that people have to like engage in order to get onto the bus.
Yeah.
It's a crazy
That is not wheelchair friendly.
Absolutely not. Nothing about that is. Yeah. And again, it's like a systemic thing. A lot of stakeholders are involved, politicians, governments.
Yeah. So much of it comes down to systems. I think that's something that a lot of people don't know when they go into industrial or, UI UX design, is how much system thinking is involved. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, to explain to people who are outside of the field when they really want to know the nitty gritty of what you do. And it does get simplified down to like, oh, you make toasters. Like, no. But then trying to explain not just the research that goes into, but the larger system that all these things have, many systems, they all have to exist within. I think that it's almost hard to teach, but it's something that you acquire over time. And then you realize that everything around us is involved in so many different systems, and it's production system, it's like interaction systems, what it is subconsciously getting us to do, and how we're behaving in response to it. It's all systems in psychology. And I think that's something that not a lot of us go into this with the awareness that by the end you're going to be a systems expert, and then you're going to have to just try to figure out how to explain to someone what that even means. But
and like I think systems design, the more diverse your background, the better you are at it. And I think with me in particular, like because I didn't set out to be a designer, I studied economics and psychology and sociology. So that really helped when I went into ID, in order to figure out where the economy fits in, where the budget fits in, are the people open to change? Mostly they're not, and that comes from like psychology topics and all of those things. Right. So like Yeah. Systems designers
Well,
are
and,
to be diverse. So yeah.
yeah. Well, and regardless, the things that you now have an acute awareness of, those factors are there anyways. You know, the financial constraints are there regardless, but coming in with an economics background, that makes you a better designer in that it makes you much more understanding of and able to work with and conversate about these other factors that regardless would have an impact. So it is nice when, even if you are a pure industrial designer, it is nice when the teams are diverse, when there's a lot of interaction, because regardless, these things are always affecting them, and the designs we make and the way that they're used. So it is really excellent when we get to break out of just the ID bubble and we get to see the much larger reality around it. And then, like you said, you have all these backgrounds that then make you a better designer. You're not relying on another expert to evaluate and communicate it to you. You can understand it during the design process.
Yeah. I think even design schools should have like maybe at least a basic economics course. It really helps out in a way.
Yeah.
Like helps out more than you would think. Understanding how, the whole system works outside the design
Yeah.
school.
I mean, it makes sense. We take manufacturing classes, and
That too. Yeah.
it would be nice, I think, as well, if psychology was a more expected component of these things. I know occasionally people will take a psychology course, but
Mm-hmm.
consumer psychology in itself is an entire discipline. And I think if we were in the molding of young designers' minds, if economics, psychology, things like that were part of the learning process, I think we would be more aware and probably more empathetic to all of the moving parts.
Right. Before we wrap up, how do I recycle everyday things?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I think this is a good one, that I think everybody is like too scared to ask. I think it's
I
one of
know.
those things where we're in too deep. If you
Yeah.
don't know now, you don't want to admit that you don't know, and you
Exactly.
certainly don't. Okay, so I'll give you a few bullet points. The number one thing is, when in doubt, throw it out, which seems counterintuitive, but the reason behind that is not just, okay, it wasn't recyclable and I thought it was. What happens when you live in a city or even a suburb, and you have a recycling facility? You have curbside, you go and you drop it off, whatever. It gets taken to a recycling facility. Usually there's one in some, especially in New England, like multiple states could use the same facility. So this is not happening on a city level, much larger than that. But in the processing of that, depending on what was incorrectly put in the bin, it can actually ruin an entire batch of recycling, which one means it all goes to landfill, which is not great, but also the cities get charged for that sort of thing. So the city will get charged for every ton that they send that has to be landfilled and disposed of, because it interrupts the system. It requires cleaning and flushing and all of these things, and it's inconvenient. And of course, like, we don't want to encourage that. So if they're fining the city, and then that prompts the city to communicate to their citizens how to better recycle, theoretically that could be effective. So I think people don't understand what happens behind the scenes that makes it so bad to just put it in the wrong bin. So as much as I say, like, you should always recycle everything whenever you can, when in doubt, throw it out. And take time to try to look what can be recycled up. No one knows what the numbers mean. That's not true, but almost no one knows what all the numbers mean. But the nice thing is, every single city and county has a website, has that information out there, that they will say, we accept 1 through 7, 1 through 5, 1 through 8, whatever it is. That's pretty easy. I would say, still hard to remember. Put it on a sticky note and put it by your recycling bin. The other component to that is, there are things that just can't be recycled. And again, talking about being a discerning consumer, do your best not to buy them. Styrofoam, stop buying styrofoam. It's not good. immediately disintegrates into small particles. It sticks to everything. It gets airborne. Whenever possible, avoid styrofoam. The other thing, and this is totally recyclable, plastic bags, plastic films. I have 3x5 cards next to me. They have like a little plastic film.
Yep.
That is recyclable, but in like 95% of the cases, it is not curbside single stream recyclable. Single stream being wherever you are, you can dump everything in one bin and they'll take it and sort it at the facility. This is absolutely not recyclable in that way.
Right. So check if your recycling system is a single stream. If it is, then those plastic you cannot.
Any regardless, even if you do sort, this does not go in the plastics. It's not recyclable with plastics. It has to be, you have to have a little plastic bag at home, fill it up with other plastic bags, and then take it to somewhere like a Whole Foods, a Target, your local grocery store, whatever. A lot of these places will have bins out front that says like specifically plastic bags and plastic film, but it's also very hard to recycle. So I think those are a couple of the things that people miss, like things like wood and other natural material that isn't paper, not recyclable. Cardboard, paper, good. If it is anything that is coated, like a paper coffee cup, not recyclable. If it is something that you, like a pizza box, in almost every situation, not recyclable. When it gets that grease, not recyclable. They've gotten to the point where a very small amount is allowable, but if you really want to do it right, cut out, rip it apart and throw out the little bit that's greasy, recycle the rest. Be mindful of things like teeny tiny bits. So if you open a thing and inside, like you open a thing of soy milk, and inside there's another tab that you open to be able to pour, and you'd throw that away because it doesn't get reattached. That is too small to be recycled. So there's all these little nits and pieces, but when in doubt, throw it out. Learn the few numbers your city recycles and avoid other things. The thing with that is most of the time, every bottle cap is the same type of plastic. Every laundry detergent bottle, the same type of plastic. So once you do this exercise a couple of times, it becomes second nature because most of these things are all the same type of plastic. And don't try to recycle like paper coffee cups, things like that. Don't put plastic bags in your single stream. And yeah, just do your best.
So when we're recycling the washing liquid, or I buy a bottle of jam and it's glass is recyclable. But what do I do with the labels? Do the labels need to be taken off?
So thankfully, in most places, no, because they have industrial processing. They're able to remove that stuff. But similar to what I said about paper cups being lined with wax, and therefore you can't recycle them, a lot of things are they're multi-material plies. So like if you get a carton of milk or soy milk or whatever, if it was just paper, it would not be able to withstand the liquid. So it has been coated usually on the interior and the exterior. So it's not paper. So there are two things I will say. If you see something has a TerraCycle logo, not a recycling label, it'll say TerraCycle. It's sort of like an infinity sign instead of the triangle. That is not recyclable in your mainstream recycling system. That's different. We won't get into it. That's a company that does really hard to recycle things. But if you get a milk jug and on the bottom it says, the paper one, and it says TerraCycle, it's not the same thing as recycling. So avoid that. And I have forgotten the other thing, but I've given you more than enough information, I think,
so
to be overwhelmed.
Cups, never put that in the recycling. A lot of people put coffee cups, especially coffee cups, in the recycling. Don't do that.
Okay. If you get a hot coffee,
right?
Take the lid off, take the little paper sleeve off, throw the cup away.
Exactly. What about if I get yogurt, right? in a plastic thingy. Since it's the paper thing, I don't think you can because it's probably lined inside. But the plastic cup with the yogurt in it, what if I wash it out? Isn't recyclable? Do I have to
It
wash it
should
out?
be. Look for the little number. It's helpful to rinse them. They do get washed, but if nothing else, it means you will not have a disgusting recycling bin and then feel that recycling is disgusting and stop wanting to do it. So, the other thing I was going to say is, and you had mentioned at the very beginning that somewhere in the UK, they were looking at changing the recycling communication. There is a group, I believe it is US based. I know we have it here in the US at least, that does a new type of recycling label. And you can probably find them on some cereal boxes. Some major labels have integrated them into a lot of their products. But I know for a fact, if you get one of those white and blue bubble mailers from Amazon, it will have this. It is a larger recycling label that specifically says all of the pieces. Because if you get a cereal box, you get a cereal box, but it also comes with a bag inside. The bag can't be recycled the same way the paper can. So these labels actually say every material, or every piece, every individual piece, and how it can be recycled or if it can be recycled. So it doesn't say, if your city doesn't take number 3, it's not going to tell you that, but it is going to say like plastic lid cannot be recycled, cardboard box can, it's this number, and then whether or not that's recyclable. So that is something to look out for, and it's actually really interesting. If you're at the grocery store and you're looking at stuff, chances are you'll come across it. And I think it's a great example of good design. It's something that is very intuitive and makes you think, why didn't we do this like 30 or 40 years ago?
Yep.
So that's a fun one. But yeah, I'd say just look it up and make a little note for yourself. And then
spend an afternoon, get familiar with these things, and then you're set. You know what to recycle.
It doesn't even take an afternoon. It takes so in 10 minutes, you can Google Providence, Rhode Island recycling rules or whatever, recyclable materials. Yeah. And it will pop up immediately. Look, write it down, put it next to the recycling bin. Done.
And you're done.
Yeah, that's my recommendation.
There you go. That was awesome. Thank you.
And thank you I'm sorry, this is kind of a downer, but
hey, sometimes we need to, feel these things so we can get up and do something, right?
Next time I will come in with here's 5 environmental victories, and we'll just hit it off on a high note,
Yeah,
you're
totally.
Here's all the good others. Stuff.
Yeah. Swing the opposite direction.
And then we can talk about all the bummer stuff. But I will do my homework, and I will bring some good news.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you guys for listening. Since I just launched this officially this week, please do me a favor and go on Apple Podcasts and rate and review. That kind of helps with the algorithm. And thank you again, Sarah. This was a really good episode. This was wonderful. Thank you for coming. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.